I am a young nurse, born and raised in the flat rice fields of northern Vietnam. At barely 19, I was too young to be hardened by the world, yet old enough to understand that my country was at war. I never held a rifle, never dreamt of charging into battle. My hands were trained not for destruction, but for mending broken bodies and easing pain. When the war drew closer to our village, I felt a quiet calling, not of glory or heroism, but of duty. I wanted to save lives, even if only in the shadows of the battlefield. I spoke softly, but my resolve was firm. If others carried rifles, I would carry bandages. If they shed blood, I would try to stop it from flowing away. I never imagined that my path would lead me to yon beyond Foth, the fortress where the fate of nations would be decided, and where my own youth would be tested in fire and blood. I grew up in a poor farming family, where the rhythm of life followed the rise and fall of the rice harvest. Our land was small, our resources thinner still, but my mother's hands, cracked from endless labor, somehow kept us alive. She often reminded me that every grain of rice was a gift paid. For in sweat my father did not live to see me grow into a young woman. He was one of the countless victims of the famine of 1945. I still remember the silence of his absence, the hollow in our household that no words could ever fill. The famine left more than empty stomachs, it carved scars into our souls. Even as a child, I could not forget the sight of neighbors collapsing along the village paths, their bodies frail and lifeless, their eyes staring at nothing. After my father's death, my mother bore the weight of our survival. She carried baskets to market, tilled the soil, and whispered lullabies to my younger sister, the only brightness in our dim world. I learned early that survival was not guaranteed, and that compassion was a form of resistance against despair. These memories shaped me, pressed into my heart like invisible wounds. They became the soil from which my determination grew. If I could not fight with weapons, then I would fight with care. After 1945. Whispers of resistance spread through every village, carried on the wind like secret prayers. Young men left their homes with bamboo spears and rifles that looked older than their fathers. Their songs of defiance echoed across the rice fields, filling the night with courage that felt larger than life. I was not a soldier, but I listened, my heart restless. My father's death during the famine had taught me that our suffering was not just fate, it was the shadow of foreign rule. Each time I saw my mother's weary figure bent over the fields, or my sister's thin arms carrying water, I felt a surge of quiet rebellion. How long could we endure loss upon loss? I knew I could not wield a weapon with strength or skill, yet I also knew that war would not spare me simply because I was a girl. So I chose another path. If others marched to the front with rifles, I would follow with bandages and medicine. If they risked their lives in the storm of gunfire, I would be there when the storm passed, gathering the broken and trying to piece them together again. In my heart, it was simple. To save one life was to defy despair, and to keep hope alive was itself a form of resistance. When I finally told my mother that I intended to leave and serve as a nurse at the front, her hands froze in mid-motion, rice grains spilling from the basket. Her face tightened, and then the tears came silently. She had already lost a husband to hunger. The thought of losing her daughter to war was unbearable. "Stay," she pleaded. "You are all I have left." My younger sister clung to the sleeve of my shirt, her small fingers trembling as she whispered, "Don't go, sister. Don't leave us." Their voices tore at my heart more sharply than any wound. I would later see on the battlefield. For nights I lay awake, torn between two duties, one to the family who had kept me alive, and one to the nation that demanded sacrifice from every hand, no matter how small. The weight pressed on me until I felt I could scarcely breathe. At last I wrote a letter to my mother. In it, I promised that I would return, that I would not seek danger, but only do my part to save lives. I told her that every bandage I wrapped, every wound I washed would be a prayer for my father, a shield for my sister, a way of protecting them from afar. Even as I sealed the letter, my hands trembled. But my resolve did not. By the winter of 1953, the war had reached its fiercest stage. The French were determined to hold their colonial grip, and in Jan beyond Faiche, they built what they called an impregnable fortress. Surrounded by mountains, armed with heavy artillery, and supplied by aircraft, they believed no force could touch them. To the outside world, it seemed unbreakable, but in the villages, the air was alive with determination. Every family, even those with little to spare, gave rice, cloth, or labor. Columns of men and women carried baskets of food, crates of ammunition, and even dismantled cannons along the treacherous trails of the TWSE mountains. The nights echoed with songs of solidarity, each verse a promise that we would endure whatever was to come. I was assigned to join one of these medical units. We set up makeshift shelters and dug out earthen bunkers to prepare for the flood of wounded that everyone knew would arrive. While the soldiers whispered about the battles to come, I studied every piece of gauze, every bottle of medicine as if they were weapons of their own. We all knew this campaign would decide more than just a battle. For my people, it was about dignity, survival, and the chance to break free from generations of suffering. Asterisk, when the order finally came for us to march toward Yeonbyeon, I felt my stomach tighten. The road ahead wound through misty valleys and steep mountain passes, where the air grew thin and cold. I had never traveled so far from my village. Every step felt like a passage into the unknown. We walked in silence at times, the crunch of our sandals and the creak of bamboo stretchers, the only sounds in the night. At other moments, we sang softly to push back the weight of fear. I tried to memorize the faces around Mitha, determined soldiers, the porters bent under impossible loads, the nurses clutching their small bundles of supplies. I knew that not all of us would return, as the mountains closed in and the roar of distant artillery rumbled across the horizon. I whispered to myself, I am not here to kill, but to keep life from slipping away. Yet deep down, I sensed that I was walking into a sea of fire and blood beyond anything my imagination had ever dared to conjure. The road to Yeonbyeon was nothing like the flat rice fields of my home. It twisted endlessly through mountains that seemed to scrape the sky, where mist clung to the ridges and rain fell like a curtain day after day. Our sandals slipped in the mud, our clothes clung to our skin, and each step felt heavier than the last. Yet the line of people moved forward, as if the weight of an entire nation pressed behind us. I walked among soldiers and porters, my small medical bag strapped tightly to my back. Ahead of me, teams of men strained at the ropes of heavy cannons, their bodies bent like bows under the pull. Their voices rose in unison, the rhythmic chant of Kyo, Fauta Vitini, Vito. Cutting through the forest, it was a song of endurance, of defiance, a reminder that even mountains could be moved if the will was strong enough. Beside them, others carried baskets of rice or crates of ammunition on bamboo poles. Each load swung with the rhythm of their steps, drops of sweat falling into the mud as if each person left behind a piece of themselves on the trail. At night, when the rain softened to a drizzle, we sang Kwamionte Biase, our voices trembling but steady. For a few moments, the music lifted us above the exhaustion. Weaving our struggles into something greater, I remember pausing on a ridge, gasping for breath and looking down at the valley below. It stretched vast and green, scattered with mist, beautiful yet unforgiving. In that moment, I realized how small I was against the immensity of the land and the war ahead. My legs ached, my shoulders burned, but inside my chest a strange fire grew stronger. I was not carrying a rifle. My hands were not meant to fire bullets. Yet as I trudged through mud and rain, step after weary step, I felt that I, too, was part of this march of history. We were climbing not just mountains, but the walls of destiny itself. Asterisk when we finally stopped to rest in a sheltered valley. Our commanders gathered the medical workers for hurried lessons. The war did not wait for anyone, so neither could our training. We sat on rough wooden benches or damp ground while an older doctor, his face lined with years of hardship, showed us how to bind wounds, stop bleeding, and recognize when surgery was the only chance left. We practiced on one another, wrapping strips of cloth around arms and legs, learning how to tighten a tourniquet with trembling fingers. Supplies were scarce, We had only a few boxes of gauze, some bottles of disinfectant, and a handful of surgical tools that looked worn from years of use. The doctor reminded us that we would often need to improvise our shirts into bandages, split bamboo into splints, or boil water for sterilization. On the battlefield, he said, a single second can mean the difference between life and death. Your hands must not shake. I listened carefully, repeating every step in my mind. My heart pounded not only from the fear of failing, but also from the weight of responsibility that now rested on me. I was not preparing to help neighbors in a village clinic. I was preparing to face the flood of broken bodies that war would hurl into our arms. One evening, as I rolled thin strips of cloth into neat bandages, a fellow nurse leaned over and whispered, "Sometimes I wonder if our hands will be strong enough. But then I think if not us, then who?" Her words stayed with me. They reminded me that our work was more than duty. It was an act of defiance, a way of keeping humanity alive amid the destruction by the time the training ended. My back ached, my fingers were raw, yet I felt sharper, steadier. I knew the days ahead would test me beyond anything I could imagine. But with each knot tied, each bandage wrapped, I promised myself that I would not falter when the wounded came. Asterisk, even as I marched farther into the mountains. My mind often drifted back to the moment I left home. It was a quiet morning, the mist still hanging low over the fields, when I told my mother I had to go. Her face tightened, and I could see the battle inside her eyes. Pride on one side, fear on the other. She pressed a small bundle into my hand, some dried rice, a few pickled vegetables, and a handkerchief she had stitched herself. "Keep this with you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Whenever you see it, remember, you still have a home to return to." My younger sister clung to my sleeve. She was too young to understand war, but old enough to feel the shadow it cast. Her tears stained the fabric of my shirt as she begged me not to leave. I knelt and hugged her tightly, promising that I would come back, though in my heart I could not be certain. That night, before joining the column of nurses, I wrote a letter to my mother. I told her not to worry, that I was not going to fight, but to heal. I promised to stay safe, to think of her with every patient I treated, to come home once the war was over. As I sealed the letter, my hands shook. It was not fear of the road ahead that made them tremble, but the weight of love I carried with me. Each step I would take, each wound I would tend, be for them, for the mother who had endured so much, and for the sister who still waited in the doorway of our home. The first time I stepped into a trench at Yan Bian, the earth seemed to swallow me whole. The walls rose above my shoulders, damp with seeping water, and the air smelled of wet soil mixed with smoke. Oil lamps flickered in the narrow passages, casting shadows that danced like restless ghosts. Every sound felt magnified, the crunch of boots, the hiss of whispers, distant thunder of artillery rolling across the valley. Then came the cries. At first faint, then sharper, until they surrounded me. I turned a corner and saw them, young men carried in on stretchers. Their uniforms dark with blood, their faces pale and eyes unfocused. My knees nearly buckled. I had imagined wounds before, in training, but nothing prepared me for the sight of torn flesh, shattered bone, and the raw human suffering that filled those narrow dugouts. For a moment, I froze, clutching the strap of my bag so tightly that my knuckles whitened. My heart raced as if it wanted to flee, but then a firm hand touched my shoulder. It was one of the older nurses. "Breathe," she whispered. "We cannot turn away now. They need us." I forced myself forward, kneeling beside the first soldier. His breath rattled in his chest, his eyes searching for something, maybe comfort, maybe salvation. I pressed cloth to his wound, my hands trembling, but I did not stop. The blood seeped through, warm and relentless, staining my uniform. I told myself over and over, steady hands, steady heart. Around me, the trench had become a world of chaos. Men groaned, doctors barked orders, shells exploded overhead. Yet in that chaos, I felt something awaken. Fear still gnawed at me, but it was joined by a fierce determination. If I could not silence the guns outside, then at least here, in this narrow strip of earth, I could fight back against death itself that night, long after my shift ended. I sat in the darkness, with my hands still stained red. I could not sleep, haunted by the echoes of cries and the faces of the wounded. But I also knew from that day forward there was no turning back. I was no longer the girl who left her village. I was a nurse of the battlefield, asterisk by the time I arrived at Yan Bien. The valley had already transformed into a fortress. The French had dug in deep, with barbed wire, concrete bunkers, and artillery hidden behind sandbags. They called it their impregnable stronghold, a trap meant to lure our forces into destruction. From where I stood in the trenches, it felt like staring at a wall of iron and fire. But our commanders had a different vision. Instead of rushing headlong into the valley, we surrounded it. Cutting off supply lines and tightening the noose with each passing day, men and women carried heavy shells up mountainsides, sometimes dragging entire cannons by hand, their bodies straining yet unyielding. I remember the ground shaking as those guns, hidden in the hills, finally opened fire. On March 13, 1954, the first salvo thundered across the valley. The earth trembled beneath my feet, and the sky lit up with flames. That night marked the beginning of the great battle of Yan Bien Phache. To the world, it was just another clash in a distant war. But to us, it was everything's the chance to break free from generations of humiliation and suffering as the shells fell. I gripped my bag tighter, knowing the wounded would soon come pouring in. My role was not to fight with weapons, but to stand ready when the storm reached us. From that moment, every hour, every heartbeat carried the weight of history. Asterisk in the brief lulls between the thunder of artillery, we clung to each other like family. The trenches were dark and damp, yet within them I found a bond stronger than any bloodline. We shared bowls of thin rice porridge, passed canteens from hand to hand, whispered stories of the lives we had left behind. There was one nurse in particular, a girl close to my age, who became my closest friend. Her laughter, even in the midst of chaos, was like a small flame that refused to die. One night, as we wrapped bandages by the dim light of a lantern, she leaned toward me and said, "We may not carry rifles, but don't you see? We are still fighting. Every soldier who walks back into the line because of us, that is our victory." Her words settled deep in my chest. Heavier than the shells that shook the earth above us, I realized then that our duty was not smaller than the men who held guns. It was simply different. Quiet resistance against despair. Sometimes during short breaks we spoke of the future, daring to dream. She said she wanted to become a teacher after the war to give children the chance she never had. I told her I wished to return to my village and work as a nurse in peace, tending to farmers instead of soldiers. For a few moments it felt almost possible, as if we were not surrounded by death, but by promises of life waiting beyond the horizon. Those conversations were our refuge. They reminded us why we endured, why we stitched wounds and swallowed fear. In the trenches, friendship became armor, and hope itself was a weapon. The night sky above Yan Bien erupted into fire. What had once been a valley wrapped in silence now throbbed with the roar of cannons and the crack of rifles. The French strongholds Him Lam, GCLPP, and the heart of Magung Than were lit up as if the heavens themselves had been torn open. Each artillery burst carved streaks of red and white across the darkness, so bright that for a moment I could see the outline of the mountains towering around us. Inside the trenches, the ground quaked beneath my boots. Earth shook loose from the walls and rained onto my shoulders as shells landed nearby. The air smelled of smoke, soil, and burning metal, a mixture so thick it coated the back of my throat. Even when I closed my eyes, the flashes of light burned against my lids, relentless as lightning from the medical station. I heard the distant orders shouted by officers, the rallying cries of soldiers charging forward, and then always the screams. They came in waves as men were carried back from the front. Sometimes, I could not tell whether the thunder in my chest was the sound of my own heart or the endless detonations outside. It was on that first night of battle that I realized war had no rhythm, no mercy. Moments of silence lasted only long enough to give birth to new explosions. The sky was filled with parachute flares, drifting down slowly like dying stars, bathing everything in an eerie glow. The trenches glimmered white for a second, then plunged back into shadow, only to be illuminated again. I remember clutching my medical bag so tightly that my hands ached. My thoughts tangled, fear of death, dread of what was to come, and yet, beneath it all, an unyielding determination. I whispered to myself, "You are not here to fight. You are here to keep them alive." It became a prayer I repeated over and over. It's almost louder than the cannons themselves. The ferocity of that night was beyond anything I had ever imagined. It was not just a battle of soldiers and weapons. It was a storm that consumed the earth itself. And yet, amid the chaos, I understood that history was being written in the fire raining down over Yanbian. I was inside it now, not as a witness from afar, but as a fragment of its bleeding heart. The wounded began arriving before midnight, carried on bamboo stretchers, slick with mud and blood. Our dugout was little more than an earthen cave carved into the side of the trench, its ceiling braced with rough logs that trembled whenever a shell landed close. A single oil lamp swung overhead, casting a weak glow that left half the room in shadow. The first soldier they placed before me had shrapnel buried deep in his thigh. His uniform was soaked crimson, his face ashen. My hands shook as I cut away the cloth, but the doctor's voice rang out behind me. "Hold the pressure now, wrap tighter." I pressed the bandage with all my strength until the bleeding slowed. My palms hot and sticky. One by one they came, their groans mixing with the distant thunder of artillery. Some cried out for mothers, some for comrades who would never return. I had to push their words out of my mind, to see only the wound, the steps, the next task. Still, every cry carved itself into me. By dawn, my uniform was no longer its original color. It clung to me, stiff with blood that was not mine. My fingers ached from tying endless knots of cloth. My back screamed from bending over stretcher after stretcher. At times, exhaustion threatened to pull me under. But then, I would catch sight of a soldier's chest rising again after nearly stopping, and it gave me enough strength to continue. The doctor shouted orders. "Prepare morphine. Clamp it now. Next patient." The rhythm became mechanical, as if we were cogs in a great machine of survival. Yet, in the moments between, I caught glimpses of humanity, another nurse wiping a soldier's brow, a wounded man whispering thank you through clenched teeth, even a faint smile from someone who knew he would live to see another day. There were failures, too. More than once, we pressed our hands against wounds that refused to close, watching life slip away despite everything we tried. Those moments stabbed deeper than any piece of shrapnel. I wanted to scream, to curse the war, but there was no time. Another stretcher always waited. In that cramped, dark shelter, I learned what it meant to fight without a weapon. We were soldiers of a different kind, waging war against death itself. And though fear gnawed at me with every explosion above, my hands kept moving, my heart refusing to surrender. It happened on a night when the sky above Yanbian seemed determined to crush us. The French bombarded the trenches relentlessly, their shells screaming overhead before tearing the earth apart. Inside the dugout, we huddled close, continuing our work even as the ceiling shook and clumps of dirt rained down on our heads. Beside me was my closest friend, the nurse who had so often shared her laughter in the darkness. She was steady that night, her hands sure as she tied a bandage around a soldier's chest wound. I remember the way she hummed under her breath, a quiet melody meant to calm both patient and self. For a moment, I almost believed we were safe. Then the explosion came. A bomb struck near the entrance of the dugout, the blast throwing us against the wall. My ears rang, my vision blurred. When the dust settled, I turned to her. She was lying still, her body twisted unnaturally, her eyes half open but already distant. I crawled to her, shaking her shoulders, whispering her name as if I could call her back. Blood stained her uniform, spreading like ink across the fabric. My hands, trained to save, pressed desperately against her wound, but there was nothing left to save. The melody she had been humming still echoed faintly in my mind, cut off mid-note. Around me, the chaos continued, soldiers crying out, doctors shouting, shells bursting overhead. But in that moment, all I heard was silence. A cold emptiness settled over me, heavier than any burden I had carried up the mountain. Can I endure all of this loss? The question burned inside me. If even the strongest among us could fall in an instant, what hope did I have? What hope did any of us have? Tears blurred my vision, but there was no time to grieve. Another soldier was thrust into my arms, bleeding, gasping for life. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, smeared red with her blood and his. My hands kept moving, even as my heart splintered. That night, I made a silent vow. If I could not save her, then I would save as many others as I could, for her sake. Every bandage I tied, every wound I cleaned, would be my way of carrying her forward. She had once told me, "We are still fighting, even without rifles." Now those words were etched into me forever, her final gift amid the fire. After her death, the war changed for me. It was no longer only the clash of armies, the thunder of artillery, or the endless stream of wounded. It became a private battlefield inside my chest, where fear and duty fought without cease. Every time I knelt beside a stretcher, my friend's face appeared before me, her half-finished smile, her humming cut short. I asked myself, why must so many lives be torn away? What meaning could justify such loss? There were moments when despair nearly crushed me. I thought of my father, who had died in the famine of 1945, another casualty of forces beyond our control. Now my friend lay among the fallen, swallowed by a different kind of hunger, the hunger of war. I wondered if I, too, would vanish nameless into the soil, leaving my mother and sister to weep as others had before them. And yet, whenever my hands hovered uncertainly above a wound, I remembered her words, "We are still fighting, even without rifles." Those words pulled me back, steady in my hands. Perhaps sacrifice was not about dying, but about giving everything one could so that others might live. My friend's death was senseless if I let despair paralyze me. But if I carried her spirit forward in every act of care, then she was still here, still fighting at night. Lying on the cold earth, I tried to make peace with the truth. War devours indiscriminately. It does not care for youth or dreams, for mothers waiting at home, or promises whispered in the dark. But what we did in the face of that cruelty, that was ours to choose. I could choose to harden into stone, or I could choose to remain human. Even when humanity felt like a wound too raw to touch, so I whispered into the silence, as if to her spirit, "Your sacrifice will not be meaningless. Through my hands, you will keep saving lives." And with that vow, I forced myself to rise each morning, to keep moving through the blood and smoke, clinging to the fragile belief that, even in war, compassion could still be a form of victory. One morning, after a night of relentless shelling, I was sent with a small team to collect the wounded from the front line. As we climbed out of the trench and onto the open ground, the air struck me first. The stench of smoke, iron, and blood mingled into something heavy, choking. The sun had barely risen. The battlefield was already a graveyard. Bodies lay scattered across the muddy plain. French and Vietnamese soldiers alike. Their uniforms told different stories, but in death, they looked the same, limbs twisted, eyes unblinking, mouths frozen mid-cry. Some still clutched rifles as if refusing to let go. Others held letters, photographs, or talismans pressed to their chests. I stepped carefully, forcing myself not to look too long at any face, afraid I might recognize someone I had bandaged only the day before. Yet even when I looked away, the images burned into my mind. A young French soldier, barely older than me, his helmet dented beside him. A Vietnamese comrade curled on his side, as if only sleeping, but caked on his eyelashes. The silence between artillery bursts was unbearable. Flies swarmed, and the smell of decay already rose with the warming air. Every sense screamed at me to run, but my duty anchored me there. We lifted the moaning, the barely breathing, from among the still. Each stretcher we filled was a small act of defiance against the vastness of death. I could not help but wonder what was the point of such carnage. Was victory measured in how many corpses covered the earth? Standing there, surrounded by the fallen of both sides, I felt the absurdity of war press down like a weight I could not shake. We were enemies, yet here they were, lying together in the same soil, their blood mixing, Indistinguishable in the mud, that day, I learned that war does not just take lives, it erases boundaries, blurring the line between friend and foe until all that remains is loss. And still, as I bent to lift another stretcher, I whispered to myself, if I can save even one, it will mean this horror has not swallowed us completely. One evening, as I was tending to the wounded, a young soldier was carried in, his face pale but strangely calm. His hand clutched a small piece of folded paper, smeared with dirt and blood. Even as we tried to stop the bleeding, he whispered, "Don't let this be lost. It's for my mother." His voice faded before the words were finished. Within minutes, he was gone. Later, when the chaos subsided, I found the note still clutched in his hand. I hesitated before unfolding it, feeling as though I were trespassing into a world too private for me. Inside were a few lines written hastily in charcoal, promises of coming home soon, reassurances that he was strong, and a final line that read, "When this war is over, I will help rebuild our village." I pressed the paper to my chest, my eyes burning. How many such letters lay hidden in pockets across the battlefield? Messages of love and hope that would never reach their destinations. These scraps of paper carried entire futures, dreams of children yet to be born, fields yet to be harvested, songs yet to be sung. I wanted to keep the letter safe, to deliver it as he had asked, but the war gave me no such chance. The names of the dead were recorded, their belongings gathered when possible, but so much was swallowed by the mud and fire. I slipped the paper back into his uniform, whispering a prayer that somehow, in another life, his mother might read his words that night. As I lay in the darkness, I thought of my own mother and sister, waiting for letters from me, and I realized every word we wrote in war was both a lifeline and a farewell. The night our artillery opened fire on the Mường Thanh airfield, the valley shook as if the earth itself had decided to rise against the fortress. I had heard many barrages before, but nothing like this. The thunder rolled without pause, each explosion a hammer beat that lit the sky in blinding flashes. From the entrance of our dugout, I could see columns of fire erupting where the shells landed, turning the airfield into a storm of dust and flame. The French planes, once so confident as they circled overhead, now fell from the sky like burning birds. One spiraled downward, its wings aflame, before crashing into the valley with a roar that silenced even the cannons for a heartbeat. For us, it was a moment of triumph. We knew their supply line was being severed, their fortress tightening into a cage. But for me, there was no time to celebrate. The wounded came faster than ever. Stretcher after stretcher filled the dugout, men screaming, bleeding, clinging to life. My hands could not keep up. Bandages ran out, morphine dwindled, and still they came. I tore strips from my own clothes to bind wounds, pressed my bare palms against injuries to staunch the flow. My body felt like it might collapse, but the roar of the guns drove me on. Amid the chaos, I caught a glimpse of something strange, determination in the eyes of the wounded. Even as they lay broken, they whispered, "Is the airfield destroyed? Did we stop the planes?" When I nodded, their faces softened, some even smiled, before slipping into unconsciousness. Their pain was unimaginable, but the thought of victory gave them strength to endure. By dawn, the valley was a haze of smoke and ruin. The airfield was in flames, and with it, the French hope of resupply. We were told the balance of the battle had shifted, that the enemy was faltering. Yet in our dugout, surrounded by groans and still bodies, victory felt like a word written in blood. That night I collapsed against the wall, too weary even to cry. The cannons had silenced the planes, but nothing could silence the cost. I whispered to myself, if this is triumph, why does it feel so heavy? After weeks of ceaseless fighting, my body was no longer my own. My arms trembled constantly, the muscles stiff as though they had turned to stone. My fingers, once nimble with bandages, had grown numb. Sometimes I could not even feel the cloth between them. When I pressed down to stop the bleeding of a wound, I wondered if it was the soldier's blood or my own sweat that soaked my hands. Sleep became a luxury I barely remembered. We worked through the nights under flickering lamps, then stumbled through the days as artillery shook the ground around us. Even when I collapsed onto a mat for a brief moment of rest, the cries of the wounded still reached me, groans carried on the wind, or perhaps only echoes inside my mind. My stomach ached with hunger, yet food lost its taste. It was just fuel to keep my legs moving, my heart beating. There were moments when I thought I would break. I remember one night, leaning against the wall of the dugout, my vision blurring, my hands refusing to close a bandage knot. For a heartbeat, I felt utterly useless, as if I had reached the end of my strength. But then another stretcher arrived, a young soldier gasping for air, his eyes wide with terror. Somehow, my hands moved again, finding the will that my body had lost. I told myself over and over, if I stop, he dies. If I rest, someone's son will not go home. That thought burned hotter than any fever, keeping me upright when exhaustion pulled me down by then. I was no longer the girl who trembled at the sight of blood. I was a husk of flesh and willpower, driven by nothing but the knowledge that I could not afford to collapse. Victory or defeat no longer mattered in those moments, only the next life to be saved, the next wound to be closed. Even when the guns fell silent for a few hours, my mind refused to rest. At night, I lay on the hard earth with my eyes closed, but the battlefield followed me into my dreams. I heard the cries of the wounded as if they were still beside Mitha, desperate pleas of men begging for their mothers. The rattling breaths of those slipping away. Sometimes I woke drenched in sweat, my hands clawing at the air as if reaching for another stretcher. The smells lingered too. The stench of blood and smoke clung to my clothes, to my skin, to the walls of the dugout. No matter how I scrubbed, I could not wash it away. Even a sip of water tasted faintly of iron. I carried the battlefield with me everywhere, an invisible shadow that refused to release its grip. Guilt gnawed at me constantly. For every soldier I saved, there were others I could not. Their faces rose before me in the darkness, accusing and pleading at once. I told myself I had done all I could, yet the question always returned. Was it enough? Some nights I whispered apologies into the void, to the ones I could not reach in time. Other nights I clenched my fists and swore I would work harder, that I would not falter again. The war had taught me that strength was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear paralyze me. Slowly, I learned to turn the nightmares into fuel. Each cry I remembered reminded me why I could not stop. Each failure pushed me to save the next soldier who came through the door. The ghosts did not vanish, but they marched with me, urging me forward. By May, the entire valley seemed to tremble beneath the weight of what was coming. Word spread quickly through the trenches. The general offensive was about to begin. For weeks we had endured the grinding battles, but now every soldier knew we were closing in on the final act. The atmosphere was electric, charged with both dread and anticipation. I felt the change within myself as well. The girl who once trembled at the sight of blood now moved with a calm resolve. Fear still lived in me, but it no longer ruled me. Instead, I found a strange steadiness, as if all the exhaustion, the grief, countless hours of work had forged something unbreakable inside. Around me, even the wounded shared in the determination. Men with bandaged limbs leaned against trench walls, insisting they were ready to fight again. Some smiled through cracked lips, whispering that victory was near. Their courage was contagious. It filled the air thicker than the smoke of gunpowder, the night the offensive began. The roar of our artillery shook the valley in waves. The ground quivered as if alive, and the French fortress shuddered under the relentless barrage. I worked through the chaos, tending to the flood of injured who poured in, but my heart no longer faltered. Each life I saved felt like another step toward the freedom we had bled for. I realized then that something inside me had shifted. I no longer asked, "Can I endure this?" Instead, I told myself, I must endure because they endure too. In that resolve, I found a strength I had never known before. The final chapter of the battle was beginning, and I was ready to face it, no longer as the frightened nurse who had first entered the trenches, but as someone who had learned to stand steady in the storm. The news reached us in the middle of chaos. I was bent over a wounded soldier, pressing cloth against a deep gash, when someone burst into the dugout shouting, "They've surrendered. The French have surrendered." For a moment, the words did not register. The battle had become such a constant storm that I could not imagine it ending. Then the cry spread from trench to trench, echoing through the valley like a wave. "Yin Bian, Fate has fallen." The dugout erupted. Nurses embraced one another with blood-stained arms. Doctors wiped their faces and wept openly, and soldiers, even those on stretchers, raised their fists in weak triumph. I felt hot tears roll down my cheeks as I clutched the soldier's hand tighter, whispering to him that the fortress was ours. His lips curved into the faintest smile before he drifted into unconsciousness. But there was no pause in our work. Even as victory rang in our ears, the wounded kept coming. Shells still smoldered outside, bodies still lay in the mud, and our dugout overflowed with groans and the stench of blood. The French had surrendered, but death had not. We worked as if the war itself had not heard the news, bandaging, stitching, and carrying. Our hearts torn between joy and grief. I stepped outside once, just long enough to see the valley. Smoke curled into the sky, and in the distance, white flags fluttered above the French positions. The mountains, witnesses 2 months of fire and blood, now stood silent. A strange stillness settled over the battlefield, heavy and unreal. I thought of my friend who had died in the blast, of the soldier whose letter never reached home, of the countless faces I would never see again. Their absence was louder than the victory songs rising around me. Yet I also felt a surge of pride. Their sacrifices had not been in vain. The impossible fortress had fallen, and with it, the illusion of colonial power. That night, as I finally allowed myself to rest for a few moments, I whispered a prayer. Not for victory we had already won, but for peace, so that no one else would have to pay the price we had paid. Asterisk, in the days following the surrender, the valley of Yanbian fell into an uncanny silence. The cannons no longer roared, the skies no longer burned with fire, yet the echoes of war clung to everything. Trenches were littered with broken helmets and twisted rifles, the earth itself scarred by craters that would not heal for years. We had won, but the battlefield did not look like triumph. It looked like grief carved into the land. Inside the aid station, we continued to work. Victory had not lessened the cries of the wounded. Men still writhed on stretchers, their lives hanging by a thread. Some died quietly even after the French had surrendered, as if the war had refused to let them go. I realized then that battles do not end when the enemy yields. They end slowly, painfully, in every breath taken by the survivors. Still, there were moments of release. I saw hardened soldiers collapse into each other's arms, sobbing like children. I heard laughter rise suddenly, startling in its brightness after months of darkness. One night, as we shared a pot of thin rice porridge, someone began to sing softly. The song spread through the dugout until even the weakest lips joined in. It was not a song of victory, but of home, of longing, of peace. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe such peace might be possible. When I looked back at myself, I saw how much I had changed. I was no longer the timid girl who trembled at her first sight of blood. I had been broken and remade by fire. My hands, once delicate, were scarred but steady. My heart, once fragile, had learned to endure sorrow without losing compassion. Yet I also knew the price of this transformation. I would carry the voices of the dead with me forever. Their faces, their final words, their dreams left unfinished, they would never fade. And maybe that was right. Perhaps remembering was the only way to honor them. To give meaning to all we had lost, we had won yea on Behanfach. But in my heart, I understood that the true battle, the struggle to heal, to rebuild, to keep memory alive was only beginning. When the campaign finally ended and I was allowed to return home, it felt almost unreal. The road back to my village seemed both familiar and strange, as if I were walking through a dream. The rice fields stretched green beneath the sun. The river wound gently past the bamboo groves, and children's laughter floated on the breeze. Yet I no longer saw these things with the innocent eyes I once had. My mother was waiting at the gate of our house, her back bent from years of toil, her eyes brimming with tears. When she saw me, she cried out my name and pulled me into her arms, as if she feared I might vanish again. My younger sister, taller now, clung to me with the same fierce grip she had the day I left. For a moment, the war seemed far away, reduced to a distant nightmare. But even in the warmth of their embrace, I felt the presence of those who had not returned. My heart swelled with joy, yet it carried a weight of sorrow that words could not ease. I smiled, but behind that smile lived the memories of trenches, of blood, of voices silenced too soon. I was home, yes, but not the same person who had left. Asterisk life in the village slowly embraced me again. The neighbors came with smiles, congratulating me on the victory. They offered bowls of steaming rice, fruits from their gardens, and words of gratitude that I hardly felt worthy of. At night, we gathered under the lantern glow. For the first time in years, I heard songs that were not drowned out by gunfire. I wanted to feel only joy, to let myself be carried by the warmth of peace. And yet, even as I laughed with my family, shadows lingered in my heart. Every cheerful face reminded me of the countless faces I would never see again, my friend who died in the blast. The soldier with the letter for his mother, the many whose names I never knew. Their absence was as real as my presence here. Sometimes, in the middle of a meal, I would pause and imagine the comrades who should have been at the table, their laughter mixing with ours. I carried their silence with me like an invisible weight. Victory had returned me home, but it had not brought them back. In that balance of joy and sorrow, I learned that triumph is never pure. Peace is sweetened by sacrifice, and every smile I shared carried a trace of tears unseen. Asterisk, even surrounded by peace, the war followed me home. At night I woke suddenly, drenched in sweat, my ears ringing with cries that were no longer there. In dreams I found myself back in the dugout, my hands pressed against wounds that would not close. The lamp swaying overhead, the smell of blood heavy in the air. Sometimes I shouted in my sleep, startling my mother and sister. They tried to comfort me. But I knew these shadows would not leave so easily. I carried the battlefield within INC sounds, its smells, its faces. A sudden clap of thunder could send my heart racing. The sight of red cloth in the market made me flinch. Even the laughter of children, so full of life, sometimes pierced me with guilt. Because I thought of those who never lived to hear such joy again, yet I refused to let the scars consume me. I told myself they were reminders, painful, yes, but necessary. They taught me the cost of freedom and the value of each breath we take in peace. I could not erase the ghosts of the war, but I could let them guide me toward compassion. The war had ended, but it had left marks deeper than any wound on flesh. Marks carved into the soul. Shaping who I had become, war taught me many things. But above all, it revealed the fragile strength of the human heart. I saw the worst cruelty, the tearing of bodies, the shattering of families, but I also witnessed the quiet courage of those who chose to save instead of destroy. Each time I bound a wound, each time I steadied trembling hands, I felt a small defiance against the chaos. I came to believe that compassion itself was a weapon, one that could not silence cannons, but could keep humanity alive in their shadow. To save a single life in such darkness was to declare that life was still precious, still worth protecting. That was my battle, and it was as real as any fought with rifles. Now, when I look back, I understand that peace is not a gift handed down by generals or treaties it is earned, painfully, by those who endure its absence. It is carved into memory by the voices we can no longer hear. So I tell myself, and anyone who will listen, peace must never be taken for granted. It must be cherished, guarded, and honored, because it carries the weight of every sacrifice that made it possible. Asterisk, as I sit now. Years after the guns have fallen silent, I carry with me the weight of countless voices. Some belong to comrades who fought until their last breath, others to the wounded, who clung to my hands in the darkness. Their faces never fade. They walk with me still. I want the world to remember them not as nameless figures in history books, but as sons, daughters, friends, and dreamers who gave everything so that others might live in peace. We carried the wounded, but they carried the dream of freedom. And that dream outlived them. If there is one lesson the war engraved upon my soul, it is this: we must guard peace as fiercely as we once fought for it. For every bandage tied, for every life saved, I learned that peace is the most precious gift, bought at a price too high to pay again. May we never forget. May we never repeat.